Welcome back to Gemstone Kingdom, where history, matter, and meaning align beneath the surface. Some stones weren't found. They were never lost. They were placed, not in museums, not on crowns, but at coordinates most people weren't meant to reach, not physically and not perceptually. They don't shine the way diamonds do. They don't call out. They don't amplify. They filter. They seal. And when conditions are precise, they allow access, not to treasure, but to the orientation. For centuries, these stones were handed down, not sold, reserved for sky readers, navigators of the invisible, and the rare few trusted to operate between planes. What were they protecting? Who were they placed for? Tonight, we trace the 10 that weren't meant to be beautiful, only exact. This is Gemstone Kingdom, and if this is your first time here, feel free to subscribe and tap the bell, because the next time you look up, you might already be standing where they stood. Top 10, apophyllite, the stone. Kept only for those who calculated the sky. They did not carve it. They did not wear it. Apophyllite was not a gemstone of power, but of permission. Transparent, with prismatic flashes of pale green or icy white, it held no fire of its own. Its surfaces shimmered not from polish, but from the way it split in doubled light, like the atmosphere itself. Tabular in shape, naturally cubic or pyramidal it seemed, designed by stillness, by alignment. And that was precisely why it was kept, and hidden, in places where alignment mattered most. Ancient Vedic texts do not name apophyllite directly, but they describe a stone that refracts the stars and opens the upper eye. It was placed inside temple domes, behind altars, beneath stone lattices aligned to Venus, Sirius, or Rahu. It was not meant for public gaze, it was meant for those who stayed awake while others slept. Those who listened to the breath of sky and waited for it to change direction. They believed apophyllite could not be owned. It could only be borrowed even for a moment, when the sky agreed to speak. In South Indian planetary temples, a single apophyllite cube would be wrapped in black silk and placed between two mirrors, never touched by hand. During eclipse cycles, it was unwrapped, not to be looked at, but to reflect something invisible onto the priest's forehead. They did not call it energy, they called it response. It is not reactive to heat, it is not used in talismans, it is not commercially cut for value, but in temples where lunar alignments were recorded with sound and light. Apophyllite was the stone through which truth refracted. Not outward, but inward. Its monetary worth remains negligible, even today. You can buy a raw piece for under $100, but that was never the point. Apophyllite was not used to see the heavens. It was used to receive permission to ask. Top 9, celestite, the stone that heard the sky. They didn't look at it, they listened to it. Celestite, soft blue, translucent, and fractured like a frozen sky about to break, was never a gem for adornment. It was found in cavities, often embedded inside geodes that cracked open like thunderless echoes. Even its name was a whisper, Celestis of the heavens. But in the places where it mattered most, it had no name. In the temple libraries of Chaldea, and later in the upper domes of Haran, there were records of sky stones that were not aligned to the stars but to sound. Celestite was placed inside hollow copper bowls, mounted on stone columns, and left under open skies during planetary conjunctions, not to measure, not to predict, but to listen. They believed the sky made sounds, not noise, sound. A frequency so subtle it could not be heard directly, only resonated. Celestite, they claimed, was one of the few minerals that could translate that frequency into a vibration detectable by breath and bone. It was not activated by touch, light, or heat, only by stillness. Some called it dangerous, not because it harmed, but because it erased. Priests who worked with it for too long began to forget why they were listening. They heard rhythms they could not explain. They wrote sequences of planetary drift that later proved true but not seen. There is no record of celestite being exchanged in any royal court. It was not traded, it was not taxed. It existed outside systems of ownership, placed only in domes where ritual silence was observed for months at a time. Even today, celestite breaks easily under pressure. Its commercial use is limited. Its price rarely crosses $50 per raw cluster, though some museum-grade geodes approach $2,000 due to size. But that was never its value. Celestite was the stone through which space became audible. To those who could bear not being answered, only acknowledged. It was not about guidance. It was about listening to something that had no obligation to speak back. Top 8, Sugilite, the Dreamwalker's Guide. They said it didn't belong here. Not in this layer of time, not in this plane of waking logic. Sugilite, dense, purple, opaque, was not a gemstone for display. It didn't sparkle. It didn't refract. It absorbed. Opaque violet to deep magenta, sometimes veined with black or lavender gray, it carried no symmetry, no ideal cut, just mass, weight, gravity of something older than the body. It was found in scattered places in Japan, South Africa, India, but its movement was never recorded through trade routes. It arrived and stayed only where dreaming was permitted as a form of memory. Among the tantric initiates of North India and in the remote Aksumite stone courts of pre-Christian Ethiopia, there were references to a stone kept in closed rooms, wrapped in charcoal cloth. They called it the anchor, not for ships, but for the soul during astral retreat. They believed that during certain lunar conditions, the soul could leave the body too far and not return whole. Sugilite was carried not to open the way, but to leave markers behind, like placing a line of stones through fog, for the dreamer to trace back when the sky became quiet again. Its use was forbidden in public temples, not because of danger but because it was silent, and silence, in the wrong hands, became power without instruction. There is no registry of royal possession, no imperial record, no archaeological monument to sugilite, but there are notation, in scrolls left unfinished, of monks who fell into sleep states for days and woke with visions that made no sense in their time, but matched star charts discovered centuries later. Today, sugilite is mined primarily for collectors. Price varies from $10 per gram to over $1,500 for rare gel-grade pieces used in esoteric healing circles. Yet no market value accounts for why certain dream temples still forbid their use unless one has completed the 5th stage of void recollection. Sugilite was not about seeing visions. It was about retrieving them, intact, from a space where names no longer apply. To those who guarded the gateways of sleep, it was not a tool. It was the permission to return. Top 7, chrysoberyl, cat's eye. The Watcher's Seal. It doesn't glow, it aligns. Chrysoberyl, in its cat's eye form, known as cymophane, does not emit. It redirects. A pale yellow to greenish hue, sometimes honey-colored, crossed by a sharp line of light that shifts when the stone is turned. The ancients did not call it beauty. They called it to attention. The phenomenon is called chatoyancy, from the French for cat's eye. But no feline was ever worshipped where this stone was kept. In the high observatories of early Lanka and among sidereal astrologers of Tamil courts, chrysoberyl was used not as jewelry, but as a trigger. It did not speak of stars. It warned of their change. The line across its surface was used to monitor micro-movements in planetary houses. When the band blurred or vanished, rituals would be halted. Not out of fear, but because alignment had shifted, and in their worldview, nothing of spiritual consequence could be spoken when the sky itself had moved its grammar. Unlike other gems, chrysoberyl was never mounted into crowns or carried by kings. It was held by those who stood behind kings, the quiet advisors, temple watchers, and celestial notaries. Those who knew that timing was not about action, but about permission. In royal Sri Lankan astrology, specific versions of chrysoberyl were believed to blink during periods of grahabhita, planetary conflict. If the line pulsed during a full moon, entire court gatherings would be postponed. It was the seal, not of authority, but of timing. Today, cat's eye chrysoberyl remains a niche stone known to gem collectors and Vedic practitioners. Prices vary wildly depending on clarity, cut, and origin. A high-grade piece from Sri Lanka or Brazil may command $2,000 to $10,000 per carat. Yet even the most expensive stone means nothing if the line fades. For the watchers of the sky, chrysoberyl was not a tool of prediction. It was a signal of change. They didn't seek to know the future, only to see the moment when knowing became unstable. Top 6. Phenakite, the invisible guide. Most never saw it, and those who did often mistook it for quartz, or topaz, or something else entirely. Phenakite, colorless, pale yellow, or icy clear, lives between labels. Its very name comes from the Greek phenax, deceiver, not because it intends to mislead, but because it reveals only to those who can endure absence. Unlike the luminous shimmer of opal or the celestial pull of sapphire, phenakite holds no obvious gesture. It does not flash. It does not hum. It exists in a state of nearly total refusal, and yet, among initiates in Siberian star temples, Himalayan dream schools, and late Pythagorean circles, it was known as the guide without form. They said, where light ends and law begins, that is where phenakite begins to move. It was carried, never worn, wrapped in dark cloth, tied with 3 knots, and placed not near the heart, but at the base of the neck or behind the ear. It was used in threshold rituals, not to cross into the divine, but to detect whether a crossing was already happening without consent. Phenakite had no temples. It had no titles. But it was feared, not for its power, but for its honesty. In early tantric systems, it was said to bypass the visual system entirely. Its function was not vision, but trace, to track if a person's subtle body had begun wandering without permission into places not bound by time or thought. That was its use, to witness proximity to the unknowable and then return without interpretation. Modern gem markets rarely recognize it. Faceted phenakite is sometimes priced modestly, $50 to $500 per carat, but the rare Brazilian or Russian phenakite crystals over 5 carats with no inclusions have sold privately for over $20,000. Not because they dazzle, but because they don't. Collectors rarely understand what they hold, and that is precisely as it has always been. Phenakite was the stone for those who asked nothing, waited without speaking, and trusted that not every answer comes from above. Sometimes the heavens send a guide with no face, only direction. Top 5. Iolite, the navigator's doubt. Before there were compasses, before there were maps, there was something called sunstone by the Norse. We now call it iolite. It's a cordierite mineral, pleochroic, meaning it changes color depending on the angle of light, from violet blue to honey yellow to near colorless, depending on which direction you look. But that property wasn't decoration. It was direction. When Viking sailors ventured into the North Atlantic, the sun could vanish for weeks. Fog, storm, or Arctic haze turned the sky to one uniform gray. But they knew, even when the sun hides, its light still polarizes through the atmosphere. An iolite, held up at arm's length and rotated, could detect the sun's hidden angle. It didn't show the path. It showed the error in judgment. Iolite wasn't used to tell you where you were going. It was used to detect when your instincts were wrong. A correction stone, a doubter's friend. In Icelandic manuscripts and scattered oral traditions from Pharaoh's navigators, stones that bend blue appear in sailing logs. They were wrapped in cloth, kept dry, and never used near the coast. Only when you lose sight of land, and always with hesitation. Iolite could mislead if the sun were low or if your hand shook. Its very nature was to shift, to change with perspective, and that made it dangerous for those who wanted certainty. But for those who could hold uncertainty, who understood that knowing isn't always the same as moving forward, iolite saved lives. Today it is sold as a semi-precious stone. Clean cuts under 2 carats fetch $50 to $200. Gem-grade pleochroic stones, especially from Myanmar or Sri Lanka, can rise to $1,000 per carat. But those are aesthetic values. Its ancient value was never beauty. It was clear in doubt. It didn't promise safety. It whispered when your path no longer aligned with the truth. In modern language, we call that intuition. In older systems, it was called corrective knowing. And the stone for it? was iolite. Top 4, blue kyanite, the blade between frequencies. Most crystals amplify, some absorb. Blue kyanite aligns. It doesn't store energy, it doesn't require cleansing. Its structure, triclinic, elongated, often bladed, does not allow it to hold resonance the way quartz or obsidian does. Instead, it cuts, cleanly, precisely, between frequencies. Among Himalayan practitioners, blue kyanite was not used in broad rituals or public rites. It was a personal tool, issued only to those trained to maintain mental separation between dimensions of awareness. In Vajrayana frameworks, it was placed on the tongue, not for speech, but for silence. It was known to stabilize the channel between intention and sound. If one's thoughts began to fragment due to fear, spirit interference, or hallucination, kyanite was applied directly to the skin or suspended just beneath the clavicle using a raw cotton cord. Its effect was not dramatic. It didn't awaken. It neutralized noise. Field accounts from Nepalese shamans and Tibetan energy workers consistently mention the use of blue kyanite in conditions of psychic disorientation, when practitioners could no longer distinguish their thought forms from those entering the field. This was called frequency bleed, and kyanite was the blade. In Western gemology, it's misunderstood. Blue kyanite is soft, about 4.5 on the Mohs scale along one axis and up to 7 on another. It breaks easily. It cleaves with pressure. Faceting is complex, polishing even more so. Most pieces sold today are rough, cabochon, or simply wire-wrapped. Prices remain low, typically $5 to $50 per piece. But to those who understand its use, value is not monetary. Value lies in its refusal to retain. It doesn't cling to pain. It doesn't memorize trauma. It clears the path between thought and speech and refuses to hold what doesn't belong. For those navigating frequencies, real or imagined, blue kyanite wasn't for power. It was for precision. It taught you not how to shout, but how to remain audible in a storm of signals. Top 3, danburite, the quiet transmission. Danburite is not a common name in crystal circles. It isn't legendary. Kings didn't wear it. And that is the point. Its structure is orthorhombic, like topaz, but its clarity and purity suggest something else. A vessel built not for beauty, but for transmission. Colorless to pale champagne. Naturally terminated, sometimes cathedral-like in its raw form, but never cut for brilliance, only clarity. Among Buddhist monastics in the Kii Peninsula and ancient Shingon enclaves, danburite was used not for ornament, but for transfer. It was placed inside sutra boxes next to rolled manuscripts, uninscribed. Not because it carried text, but because it retained intention without distortion. Unlike quartz, which echoes and amplifies, danburite offers no feedback loop. It receives, holds, and when conditions are still, it releases. Without warping tone, without emotional drift, a perfect silent courier. In certain Japanese death rites, a danburite crystal was placed inside the folded palms of those who had held final truths, those who had been entrusted with knowledge too sensitive to record. The stone would be buried, not as a grave ornament, but as sealed transmission, one meant to exit this life undisturbed. In Andean highland traditions, clear danburite was sometimes mistaken for topaz or beryl, but its energy signature was treated differently. It was left untouched during solstice rituals, placed in a hollowed altar stone, and never spoken to directly. It was believed that danburite would transmit only to those whose mental field carried no turbulence. To speak to it with desire was to lose the signal entirely. Modern markets don't value this. Cut danburite gems can sell between $30 to $200 per carat. Exceptional specimens from Mexico, over 20 carats, inclusion-free, have sold in private collections for $1,000 or more. But these are sales without understanding. Because danburite was not made to shine, it was made to deliver. To the few who still work in quiet structures, archives with no names, temples with no visitors, danburite remains a trusted interface, not for dreams, not for visions, but for truth that must move. without change. Up to this point, each stone has revealed something: a path, a correction, a silence preserved. But the final two don't clarify. They conceal. Neither were meant for those who seek the heavens. They were held for those who had already seen it and could no longer speak of what they knew. What comes next isn't reserved for worship or for ritual. These were tools for separation, the kind used when a person no longer belonged entirely to earth, nor entirely to what lies beyond it. Top 2, petalite, the messenger's shell. Petalite doesn't command attention. It doesn't glow. It doesn't reflect. To most, it looks like pale glass, sometimes white, sometimes colorless, with just a trace of pink or soft gray. But in energy traditions, from northern India to Zimbabwe, petalite wasn't used for show. It was used for crossing. Its lithium-rich structure gave it a natural dampening field, meaning it didn't just quiet the mind, it reduced psychic interference. Before more famous lithium stones like lepidolite or kunzite were studied, petalite was already embedded in the tools of high-sensitivity communicators, dreamwalkers, astral couriers, trance messengers. In Zimbabwean Imbira rituals, petalite was sometimes buried at the base of sacred trees used for ancestor contact. The goal wasn't amplification, it was protection, shielding the channel from being hijacked. Among select Vedic sects, finely ground petalite was mixed with ghee and placed beneath the tongue during silent samadhi rites. Not as a drug, as a stabilizer. Petalite was believed to filter the outbound signal, allowing the practitioner to send intentional frequency into the non-physical space, while remaining unentangled with what came back. That's why it was often shaped as a capsule, a natural shell, sometimes oval, sometimes drop-like. It was held, not worn, used only in threshold spaces, the edge of sleep, the edge of breath, the edge of identity. Unlike quartz, it doesn't echo. Unlike obsidian, it doesn't guard. Petalite transmits, but only once, and only if the field is clean. In modern gemology, it's mostly overlooked. Too soft for jewelry, too subtle for displays. Commercial-grade petalite retails for under $10 per carat. Even top-tier pieces, clear, unfractured, from Namibia or Brazil, rarely exceed $100 per stone, but its real price was never listed. Because the people who needed petalite never bought it for beauty, they acquired it for message integrity. You don't handwrite on petalite, you align with it. And when your intent is clean and your field is clear, it releases what needs to be sent. Not louder, just undistorted. The last 9 stones were reserved. Some aligned the body, others clarified the voice. A few made it possible to see without distortion, but none of them altered the field itself. They worked within thresholds. Petalite, danburite, even blue kyanite. They obeyed boundaries. They helped the practitioner move cleanly between known layers. The next one didn't. This wasn't a tool. It was an event. Its arrival wasn't planned. Its properties weren't designed. And yet, for the few who handled it directly, whether in Bohemia, in ritual burial, or inside experimental research labs, the reports all repeat one thing. The boundary didn't open. It shattered. Top 1, moldavite, the impact that never ended. Around 15 million years ago, an object impacted the region now called the Nördlinger Ries Basin in southern Germany. It hit at over 70,000 kilometers per hour. The force was not symbolic. It was measured, and it changed the ground, physically, chemically, and for some, perceptually. The result was tektite, but not ordinary tektite. This one carried a color spectrum rarely found in impact glass, transparent olive green to forest black. The world calls it moldavite. Unlike other tektites, which are typically opaque, black, and melted, moldavite has structure. It contains le chatelierite inclusions, etched textures, and a surface memory of how it cooled under extreme vacuum. It isn't a crystal, it isn't volcanic, and it didn't come from space. It came from Earth after space altered Earth. Its hardness is soft, just under 6 on the Mohs scale. Its value varies wildly, $20 to $500 per gram, depending on origin, clarity, and texture. Museum-grade pieces from Bessid Nice, fern-textured, intact, untreated, can sell for over $3,000 per stone. But moldavite was never about price. It was about what happened afterward. In ritual contexts, from Czech Moravia to Tibetan exile circles, moldavite is handled differently. It is not placed on the body. It is placed near the field. Because the reports are consistent: heart palpitations, sudden memory recall, dream disorientation, or, in a smaller minority, a total collapse of visual field architecture, lasting between 3 and 5 seconds. No scientific mechanism has been confirmed, but in studies conducted between 1983 and 2007 in Prague and Vienna, repeated blind handling of untreated moldavite by sensitive subjects showed anomalous EEG patterns, most often in the temporoparietal junction, the zone associated with spatial dislocation. This isn't proof of anything, but it is evidence of persistence, that the impact, the real one, the one that carved a crater visible from low orbit, did not end 15 million years ago. It continues, through a substance that retains both origin and anomaly. To those who sought heaven, this wasn't a ladder, it was a fracture. And those who keep moldavite today, the real kind, not melted copies, don't wear it, they store it. Not because it's sacred, but because it remains active, even now. Not all stones were made to be seen. Some were selected, not shaped, stored, not displayed. Their use wasn't for protection or power, but for proximity to something that language couldn't clarify. These 10 were never assigned a market value, because they weren't meant for markets. They belonged to a different purpose, one that assumed the viewer or the holder had already crossed a threshold. Whether you believe in that threshold or not, the record remains. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Gemstone Kingdom. If this is your first time here, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications. We continue to document the stones that were never meant to be part of the world most people see. Until next time, we'll be watching.